The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac of Denver International Airport as Flight 447 prepared for its journey to Chicago. It was a typical Tuesday in April, the kind of day where thousands of passengers would board commercial aircraft without a second thought, going about their ordinary business in an ordinary way. But on this particular flight, ordinary would become extraordinary in ways no one could have predicted. Stewardess Maria Gonzalez had been working commercial flights for 12 years, and she prided herself on being able to read people. It was a skill that came naturally after thousands of hours in the air, watching human behavior in confined spaces. She could spot nervous flyers from across the cabin, the business executives checking their watches obsessively, the elderly couples holding hands as they walked down the aisle. But when she noticed the boy in seat 15F during the boarding process, something clicked in her mind. This one was different. Distinctly, unmistakably different. The boy appeared to be no older than 13, maybe 14 at the absolute most. He was slender, with jet black hair cut in a precise, almost military fashion. His posture was impeccable as he settled into his seat by the window, his movements deliberate and controlled. What struck Maria most was his absolute stillness. While other passengers fumbled with their phones, asked flight attendants questions, struggled with overhead compartments, and generally exhibited the nervous energy typical of air travel, this boy simply sat. He gazed out the window with calm, observant eyes, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His clothing was equally notable. He wore khaki pants that were pressed to perfection, with a crease so sharp it could cut paper. His shirt was a crisp navy blue, buttoned all the way to the collar, and over it hung a leather bomber jacket, the kind of jacket that suggested a story, a heritage, a significance. The jacket was worn but well-maintained, with small patches on the sleeves and a faded emblem near the chest. It was the kind of jacket that belonged to someone important, someone with a past. As Maria pushed the beverage cart down the aisle, she made a deliberate point to stop at seat 15 if she wanted to get a closer look at this peculiar young passenger. "Good morning," she said warmly. "Welcome aboard Flight 447. Can I get you anything to drink?" The boy turned to her with eyes that seemed far too mature for his age. They were sharp, intelligent, and focused, the eyes of someone who paid attention to details. "Yes," he said, his voice steady and measured with surprising gravitas. "Black coffee, please, no sugar." Maria paused for just a fraction of a second. Black coffee, no sugar. A child who drank his coffee like a seasoned pilot at 6 in the morning. She'd heard stories like this before. Military kids, she thought. Kids from military families who'd been raised around discipline and structure. But there was something more here, something deeper that she couldn't quite put her finger on. "You got it," she said, pouring the coffee into a cup with practiced efficiency. As she handed it to him, she noticed his hands. They were small, yes, befitting his age, but they were steady. No trembling, no nervous energy. He accepted the cup with a quiet "thank you" and returned his gaze to the window. Maria continued down the aisle, but her mind kept drifting back to seat 15F. She found herself watching the boy throughout the boarding process. While the aircraft filled with the usual chaos of people settling in, overhead bins being shoved, conversations becoming louder, children crying, people jockeying for position, the boy never moved. He sipped his coffee slowly, methodically, his eyes tracking the ground crew outside the window as they completed their pre-flight checks. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Maria noticed something else about him. Around his neck, hanging just visible above his navy blue shirt collar, was a military-style identification badge. She couldn't quite make out the details from where she stood, but the presence of it was unmistakable. This was no ordinary young passenger traveling alone. This was a child with credentials. When they reached cruising altitude and the plane leveled off, Maria wheeled her beverage cart back through the cabin. She stopped again at seat 15F, ostensibly to check if the boy needed anything else, but really to get another glimpse of that ID badge. As she leaned in slightly, she caught sight of it more clearly this time. military insignia, official lettering, and below it a photograph of the boy himself, looking even more serious than he did in person. "Everything all right?" the boy asked, noticing her lingering presence. "Can I get you anything else?" she replied, recovering quickly. "More coffee?" "No, thank you," he said politely. "I'm fine." Maria retreated to the galley area where she found her colleague David preparing breakfast trays. "David," she said, keeping her voice low, "do you see that kid in 15F, the one by the window?" David glanced down the aisle and shrugged. "Yeah, the quiet one. What about him?" "He's traveling alone," Maria said. "He has a military ID badge. He ordered black coffee like he was a 40-year-old businessman, and he hasn't moved or made a sound since we took off. Something about him is, I don't know, off, important." David raised his eyebrows. "Military kid, probably. There are lots of them these days." But Maria shook her head. There was something more to this than just being a military kid. She'd worked enough flights to know the difference between a well-disciplined child and one who seemed to carry actual responsibility on his shoulders. As she continued through the cabin, she found her eyes drifting back to seat 15F repeatedly, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite suppress. 2 hours into the flight, during the period when most passengers had settled into reading, sleeping, or watching the in-flight entertainment, Maria saw the boy reach into his backpack and pull out a manila folder. Her pulse quickened. She was passing by with a stack of pillows when she caught a glimpse of the contents: official letterhead, government seals, and gold-embossed text that read, "Fighter Pilot Training Program." Maria's breath caught in her throat. A fighter pilot training program for a 13-year-old. It was impossible. It was extraordinary. It was something she needed to know more about. She continued down the aisle, her mind racing with possibilities. She had to tell someone about this. She had to know his story. And most importantly, she had to alert the pilots. Because if there was one thing she'd learned in her 12 years of flying, it was that unusual circumstances often required immediate attention from the flight crew. Maria made her decision. She would approach the boy again, carefully and respectfully, to learn more about him. Because whatever story seat 15F held, it was clearly far more significant than anyone boarding this flight could have possibly imagined. The afternoon light had shifted, casting a different quality of illumination through the cabin windows as Flight 447 continued its journey across the American heartland. Most passengers were absorbed in their own worlds by now, some sleeping fitfully against the window, others watching movies on the small seatback screens, a few working on laptops with determined expressions. The ambient noise of the aircraft had settled into that characteristic hum that made most people drowsy and introspective. Maria had returned to the galley to prepare lunch service when she noticed David walking toward her with a peculiar expression on his face. His eyes were wide, and he was moving with a deliberate slowness that suggested he was trying not to draw attention. "Maria," he whispered urgently, leaning against the counter. "Come look at something. Casually, don't stare." Maria's heart rate immediately elevated. She glanced around before following David toward the rear of the cabin. "What is it?" she whispered back. David subtly gestured down the aisle with his head. "Seat 15, F the kid." Maria moved forward as if checking the overhead compartments, positioning herself where she could see the boy without appearing to look directly at him. What she saw made her mouth go dry. The mysterious passenger had spread his documents across his tray table with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to important work. The manila folder had been opened, revealing page after page of official military documentation. But more striking than the documents themselves was the boy's demeanor as he reviewed them. His young face displayed a level of concentration and maturity that seemed utterly impossible for his age. He didn't look like a child reviewing homework or reading a comic book. He looked like a military officer conducting mission briefing preparations. Maria watched as he turned a page slowly, his eyes tracking each line with laser-like focus. Every few seconds he would pause, close his eyes as if committing something to memory, then continue. His finger traced across words, technical words, Maria could see from where she stood, and his lips moved silently, as if he were pronouncing unfamiliar terminology. Then Maria saw it. The heading on one particular page, embossed in official military gold lettering, Advanced Fighter Pilot Training Program Candidate Profile. Her breath caught audibly, and she had to turn away to maintain her composure. A fighter pilot training program. For this child, it was incomprehensible, yet there it was, right in front of her, unmistakable evidence that whatever was happening in seat 15F involved something far beyond the ordinary. Maria returned to the galley where David was waiting, his expression hovering between curiosity and concern. "Did you see the documents?" he asked. "Military training program," Maria said quietly, still trying to process what she'd witnessed. "Fighter pilots, I think. David, what is a 13-year-old doing with fighter pilot training credentials?" David's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. I saw the letterhead. Advanced Fighter Pilot Training Program. I couldn't read all the details, but—" Maria trailed off as a passenger approached the galley requesting a beverage refill. She smiled professionally, served the passenger, and waited until they had returned to their seat before continuing. "I'm going to approach him," Maria decided. "I need to know what this is about." "Carefully," David warned. "If it's military business, he might not appreciate being questioned." Maria nodded and took a deep breath. She gathered a water bottle and a cup of ice, using these as her excuse to approach seat 15F again. When she arrived at the boys' row, she noticed he had hastily begun gathering his documents, as if sensing her presence. His movements were quick but not panicked, controlled, like someone trained in discretion. "I hope you're settling in okay," Maria said, positioning herself at the armrest in a way that allowed her to be conversational without hovering threateningly. "Can I refresh your water?" "That would be nice, thank you," the boy replied, and Maria noticed something new in his voice now, a slight guardedness that hadn't been there before. He knew she'd seen something. He knew she had questions. As Maria poured water into the cup, she took a measured risk. She didn't ask directly about the documents or his credentials. Instead, she asked something more personal. "Are you traveling for anything special today?" The boy was quiet for a moment, and Maria could see him making a calculation behind those intelligent eyes. He was deciding whether to answer, whether to trust her. Finally, he said, "Family business, of sorts." It was vague, but it was something. Maria pressed gently. "Military family business." The boy's eyes met hers directly, and there was a flash of something. Surprise, perhaps, that she'd deduced this much. He studied her carefully, as if assessing her trustworthiness. "My father was a pilot," he said quietly. His voice, when he spoke about his father, changed slightly. There was an undercurrent of emotion there, pride, grief, determination, all wound together into a single statement. Maria leaned in slightly, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine human interest. "Was. He's no longer with us," the boy said, and though his words were measured, his hands gripped the armrest slightly tighter. "But I'm following in his footsteps." "That's admirable," Maria said sincerely. "What was his name, if you don't mind my asking?" The boy hesitated again, but this time, the hesitation seemed to be about something else entirely. It was as if he was deciding whether sharing his father's name would open floodgates of conversation and emotion that he wasn't sure he was ready to navigate. Finally, he took a breath and spoke, his young voice steady and clear despite the undertones of emotion. "They called him Viper," he said. "That's his call sign, that's his legacy." Maria felt the air in the cabin suddenly become very still around her, even as the aircraft continued its steady flight through the sky. Call sign, military terminology. This boy wasn't just traveling, he was carrying his father's identity with him. And more than that, he was carrying the weight of a legacy. Viper, Maria repeated softly, almost reverently, though she didn't fully understand why the name seemed so significant. That's a powerful name. Yes, the boy agreed, and I'm going to earn it. Before Maria could ask what he meant, he continued, My name is Victor, and my call sign is Viper 2. Now. The revelation hung in the air between them like a confession. This wasn't just a military kid traveling alone. This was a boy named Victor who was carrying his deceased father's call sign, Viper, and working to become a fighter pilot himself. The gravity of what she just learned settled over Maria like a weight. That's beautiful, Maria said genuinely, though she felt like her single word was entirely inadequate to capture the depth of what Victor had just shared. Your father would be proud. Victor nodded slightly, and Maria could see the suggestion of moisture in his eyes before he turned back to his documents. She understood in that moment that this conversation had exhausted his willingness to share personal details. She excused herself quietly and made her way back to the galley. Once she was out of Victor's line of sight, Maria pulled David aside again. Her mind was racing, her heart was pounding, and she knew with absolute certainty that something momentous had just occurred on Flight 447. His father was a military pilot, Maria said quickly and quietly. A fighter pilot. They called him Viper. David's face went pale. Viper, he repeated. You know that name? Maria asked, surprised. No, David said slowly, but I think the pilots upstairs might. Maria's eyes widened as the implications of that statement sank in. Without another word, she made her way toward the cockpit door, her pulse racing with the certainty that she was about to uncover something extraordinary. The cockpit of Flight 447 was a sanctuary of controlled chaos. Captain James Mitchell sat in the left seat, his hands resting lightly on the control yoke, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with the practiced ease of 17 years of flight experience. Beside him, Lieutenant Sarah Chen occupied the right seat, her attention divided between the navigation systems and the weather radar. Both pilots had settled into the steady rhythm of cruising flight, that meditative state where everything was routine, everything was known, and everything was precisely under control. It was the knock on the cockpit door that broke that serenity. In modern commercial aviation, the cockpit door remained locked during flight for security reasons. A knock, especially an unscheduled knock, was unusual. James and Sarah exchanged a quick glance. James reached over to the intercom system. This is the flight deck, he said professionally. Who's at the door? It's Maria, Captain, came the stewardess's voice, and James immediately sensed the urgency beneath her professional tone. I need to speak with you. It's important. Security-related, possibly. That got his attention. James pressed the button to unlock the cockpit door, and Maria slipped through quickly, closing it behind her. She looked flushed, her breathing slightly elevated, and her eyes held an expression that suggested she was carrying information of considerable weight. Ma'am, what's the situation? Sarah asked, turning slightly in her seat, her pilot's training making her immediately alert to potential problems. There's a passenger, Maria began, speaking quickly but carefully. Seat 15F, a young boy, traveling alone. I've observed some unusual circumstances, and I overheard a conversation that I think you need to know about. James's jaw tightened slightly. Unusual circumstances involving passengers were never good news. What kind of circumstances? He has military credentials, Maria said. A military ID badge. He's carrying official military documents related to a fighter pilot training program. And when I spoke with him, he told me. She paused, seeming to gather herself for what came next. He told me that his father was a fighter pilot, that his father's call sign was Viper. The word hung in the cockpit like a thunderbolt. James felt his hands go cold on the control yoke. The color drained from his face so completely that Sarah immediately grabbed his arm, her eyes widening with concern. "James, what's wrong?" "Did you say Viper?" James asked, his voice suddenly hoarse and distant, as if he was speaking from very far away. Maria nodded, her eyes moving between both pilots, clearly sensing that she had just revealed something monumentally significant. "Yes, Viper. That's what she said his father's call sign was." Sarah's hand tightened on James's arm. "Oh my God," she breathed. "James, that's not possible." James couldn't speak. His mind was flooded with memories, sharp, crystalline memories that he hadn't allowed himself to fully access in years. Major Victor Harrison, call sign, Viper, one of the finest fighter pilots he'd ever known, one of the best men he'd ever served with, one of the people he'd lost. 7 years. It had been 7 years since they'd received the notification. 7 years since they'd all gathered, their faces etched with grief, learning that Viper's aircraft had gone down in a classified operation over foreign airspace. 7 years of wondering what his family was doing, where his wife and son had gone, how they were coping with the loss. "The boy," James said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "What's his name?" "Victor," Maria said. "Victor Harrison Jr. He also goes by Little Viper," he said. Sarah made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "His son," she whispered. "Viper's son is on this aircraft." James closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breathing. 7 years of resignation, 7 years of accepting loss, and suddenly the son of his fallen brother-in-arms was sitting in seat 15F, carrying his father's legacy forward. The implications of this were almost too overwhelming to process. "What does he look like?" James asked, opening his eyes. "Young," Maria described. "Maybe 13 or 14, black hair, very serious, very disciplined. He carries himself like someone who's been trained. He ordered black coffee without sugar. He reviewed military documents like he knew exactly what he was reading." James turned to Sarah, and she could see the barely suppressed emotion in his eyes. "That's Viper's son," he said with absolute certainty. "That's his boy." "We have to do something," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the tremor of emotion underneath. "We can't just leave him sitting there. He needs to know that there are people on this aircraft who knew his father." James nodded slowly, his mind already racing through the protocols and procedures. Commercial aircraft regulations were strict about cockpit access, but there were ways to handle this that wouldn't compromise safety or security. "Maria," he said, turning to the stewardess, "I need you to tell him something. Tell him that the pilots would like to speak with him privately once we've reached cruising altitude and after the meal service. Tell him it's routine security verification. Don't alarm him." "Can you do that?" "Of course," Maria said, and James could see the understanding dawning in her eyes. She knew now that this wasn't just unusual, this was sacred. This was a moment that mattered. "And Maria," Sarah added, "don't tell him why we want to speak with him. Let him wonder, let him be surprised." Maria nodded and left the cockpit, securing the door behind her. For a moment, James and Sarah sat in silence, the weight of what had just been revealed settling over them like a heavy blanket. "I can't believe he's here," Sarah said quietly. "I can't believe Viper's son is on this flight." James nodded slowly, his eyes returning to the instrument panel, though his mind was clearly somewhere else entirely. 7 years, he said. 7 years since we lost him, and now his legacy is sitting in seat 15F. He paused, swallowing hard. "Do you remember what he said? At the last briefing before his final mission?" Sarah closed her eyes. "He said he wanted to make his son proud, that he hoped his son would grow up understanding that sometimes you have to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself." "Well," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "looks like that boy understands it already." The two pilots sat in contemplative silence for several long moments. Around them, the aircraft continued its steady flight across the sky, carrying within its fuselage a boy who was about to experience something that would change his life forever. Because in a few hours, when the meal service was complete and the cabin had settled, that boy was going to walk into the cockpit and see the faces of men who had known his father, who had served beside him, who had mourned his loss. And in that moment, the legacy of Major Victor "Viper" Harrison would come full circle. James reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand without looking at her. She squeezed back, understanding the weight of what they were both feeling. Outside the windows, the sky stretched endlessly before them, bright and clear and full of possibility. Somewhere in the cabin behind them, a boy named Victor sat with documents about fighter pilot training, unaware that his father's brothers-in-arms were preparing to meet him. Unaware that the pilots flying this aircraft had served with his father. Unaware that in just a few hours, his life would shift on its axis in ways he could never have anticipated. The stage was set, the reunion was coming, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Victor had finished his lunch service an hour ago, and the cabin had settled into that peculiar quiet that defined the middle section of any long flight. Most passengers were sleeping, reading, or lost in the hypnotic blue glow of their seatback entertainment screens. He had returned to reviewing his fighter pilot training materials, trying to absorb every technical detail, every specification, every piece of knowledge that might give him an edge when he finally began his formal training at the academy. That was when Maria approached him again, her expression carefully neutral but with something underneath, something knowing, something anticipatory. "Victor," she said quietly, leaning down so only he could hear. "The captain would like to see you in the cockpit. It's just a routine security verification. Nothing to worry about. When you're ready, just come to the front of the aircraft and knock on the cockpit door." Victor's immediate reaction was confusion. Security verification, on a commercial flight, that wasn't standard procedure. But he was trained enough, disciplined enough to understand that questions could wait. He nodded politely. "Of course, thank you." He carefully organized his documents, returning them to his manila folder with the same methodical precision he applied to everything. He stood, straightened his blazer, and made his way forward through the cabin. Several passengers looked up briefly as he passed, but most were too absorbed in their own affairs to pay much attention to a solitary boy walking toward the front of the aircraft. The flight attendant's area was quiet when he arrived. David smiled at him encouragingly and gestured toward the cockpit door. Victor took a breath, raised his hand, and knocked. There was a brief pause. Then the door unlocked, and it swung open to reveal the interior of the flight deck, an environment Victor had only ever seen in photographs and flight simulator videos. Beyond the threshold stood Captain Mitchell in the left seat, and in the right seat was Lieutenant Chen. Both were turned partially around, looking at him with expressions that seemed far too intense for a routine security check. "Come in, son," Captain Mitchell said, his voice carrying a weight and warmth that immediately signaled this was anything but routine. Victor stepped through the doorway, and Lieutenant Chen moved out of the right seat to give him space. The cockpit was smaller than he'd imagined, more intimate, with multiple glowing screens displaying flight data, navigation information, and system status. But Victor barely registered any of it. His attention was entirely on the two pilots' faces. "Victor Harrison," Captain Mitchell said, and the way he spoke the name with such deliberate care, such profound respect, made Victor's pulse quicken. "Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Victor replied, his young voice steady despite the sudden surge of adrenaline through his system. Something was happening here, something significant, something connected to his father. Captain Mitchell stood, and even in the confined space of the cockpit he seemed to loom large. He extended his hand. "I'm Captain James Mitchell. I knew your father very well." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Victor felt something catch in his chest, a combination of hope, grief, longing, and 1,000 other emotions he couldn't quite name. He took the captain's hand, and Mitchell's grip was firm but gentle, his eyes intense with emotion that seemed barely held in check. "You knew my father?" Victor asked, his voice smaller than he intended. "Son," Lieutenant Chen said softly, and Victor turned to look at her. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chen. We both served with your father, we flew with him, we trained with him. He was—" She paused, her eyes glistening with tears she was clearly trying to contain. "He was an exceptional man, an exceptional pilot, and an exceptional friend." Victor felt his own eyes begin to burn with moisture. This was happening. This was real. These people knew his father. These people could tell him things about Major Victor "Viper" Harrison that he'd never heard before. "We didn't know you were on this flight," James said, gesturing for Victor to sit in the jump seat, a small auxiliary seat behind the two pilot positions. "When your flight attendant mentioned that a young passenger was carrying military training documents and mentioned the call sign Viper, he trailed off, clearly struggling with emotion. "We knew immediately. We knew it had to be you." Victor sat down slowly, feeling like he might not be entirely steady on his feet. "I didn't think anyone remembered. It's been so long, I thought." He couldn't finish the sentence. "We remember him every single day," Sarah said firmly. "Your father was the kind of man you don't forget, the kind of pilot who changes the way you see the world, the kind of person who makes you want to be better." James returned to his seat but swiveled it around so he was facing Victor directly. "Your father was my commanding officer, but he was more than that. He was my mentor. He taught me everything I know about flying, not just the technical skills but the philosophy behind it, the responsibility, the commitment to something bigger than yourself." "He talked about you," Victor said quietly. "In my memories, he said." Victor's voice cracked slightly. "He said he wanted me to understand that being a pilot wasn't just about flying. It was about serving something important." Sarah reached over and placed a hand on Victor's shoulder. The gesture was maternal, protective, and it brought a fresh wave of emotion through the young boy. "He was so proud of you," she said. "He carried a picture of you in his flight suit, every single mission. He would show it to us and talk about how smart you were, how determined, how much you reminded him of himself when he was young." Victor looked away, unable to manage the intensity of what he was hearing. For 7 years his father had existed in his mind as a memory, a photograph, a legend. But now, suddenly, his father was becoming real again in these two people's voices and eyes and tears. His father had been proud of him. His father had carried his picture on dangerous missions. His father had believed in him. "We want you to know," James said, his voice carrying the weight of official pronouncement, "that the military community that your father served with, we're here for you. Whatever you need, whatever you're trying to accomplish, you're not alone." Victor nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He looked at these two people, Captain James Mitchell and Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who had piloted countless aircraft, who had completed hundreds of missions, who represented the very pinnacle of the profession his father had dedicated his life to. And they were looking at him with an expression that was part grief, part hope, part recognition of something essential and unbreakable. "There's something else," Sarah said softly. "We want to ask you something, the call sign Viper. Are you carrying it as tribute or are you planning to earn it yourself?" Victor straightened slightly, understanding the significance of the question. "I'm going to earn it," he said firmly. "I'm not just going to carry his legacy. I'm going to prove I'm worthy of it. I'm going to become a pilot, a real pilot, and I'm going to make my own name while honoring his." James smiled then, a smile that held years of grief transformed into something like hope. "That's what he would have wanted," James said. "That's exactly what Victor would have wanted." The three of them sat in the quiet cockpit, surrounded by the gentle hum of the aircraft's engines, suspended between earth and sky. Above the clouds, in that liminal space between points of departure and arrival, something profound was occurring. A legacy was being passed forward. A boy was finding his tribe. And two pilots were discovering that their fallen brother hadn't truly left them. He lived on in the determination and character of his son. "Come here," James said finally, and he stood and opened his arms. Victor moved forward, and the captain embraced him with the kind of hug that only comes from profound loss and profound love. Sarah wrapped her arms around both of them, and for a moment, the three of them stood together, bound by blood, by service, by the memory of a man who had changed all their lives. When they finally separated, there were tears on all their faces. But there was also something else, something like healing, something like grace. After they landed in Chicago and the aircraft came to a stop at the gate, Captain James Mitchell and Lieutenant Sarah Chen made an unprecedented request. They asked Victor to wait while the other passengers deplaned, then invited him to join them at a quiet airport lounge where they could talk without interruption. Victor, understanding the significance of what was happening, agreed without hesitation. The lounge was nearly empty at that hour, just a few scattered travelers checking emails and sipping coffee. James, Sarah, and Victor settled into a corner booth, away from curious eyes. An attendant brought them beverages, coffee for the pilots, a soft drink for Victor, and James leaned back, his expression open and ready to listen. "Tell us your story," James said simply. "We want to know everything, how you got on that flight, what you're doing, where you're going, everything." Victor took a breath, gathering his thoughts. He'd rehearsed this story in his mind 1,000 times, but speaking it aloud to these people, these keepers of his father's memory, felt different. It felt sacred. "My father died 7 years ago," Victor began, his young voice steady despite the weight of the subject. "I was 6. I don't remember him as clearly as I wish I did. Most of what I know comes from photographs, videos, and stories from my mother and grandmother." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "After he died, my mother, she wasn't okay. The grief was too much. She needed time to heal, and being in the house where they'd lived together, seeing his flight jacket, sleeping in a bed where they'd slept, it was too painful." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Victor's hand gently. "That's understandable," she said softly. "My grandmother took me in," Victor continued. "I've lived with her in Montana for the past 7 years. She's incredible. She raised me, cared for me, and she told me stories about my father constantly, about his bravery, his intelligence, his passion for flying." Victor's eyes grew distant. "She kept his memory alive for me. She made sure I understood who he was, what he stood for." "Where's your mother now?" James asked carefully. "She's recovering," Victor said. "She got help. She went through therapy and she's been getting better. She remarried 2 years ago, a good man, a kind man. They have a daughter together now, my half-sister. She's 3 years old." A small smile crossed Victor's face. "My mother finally found peace. She found happiness again. And she told me it was because she learned to accept that my father's death wasn't the end of his legacy. It was the beginning of a new chapter." Sarah nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "And that chapter included you." "Yes," Victor said. "When I was 10, I started asking questions about becoming a pilot. My grandmother took me to air shows. She introduced me to military personnel she knew from my father's service. She helped me understand that I could honor his memory by following in his footsteps, not because I was obligated to, but because I genuinely wanted to." James leaned forward. "Tell us about the academy." Victor's entire demeanor shifted, becoming more animated. 3 years ago, I began formal training through a military youth pilot academy in Montana. It's one of the most selective programs in the country. Only the most qualified candidates are accepted. I had to pass extensive physical and psychological evaluations, academic testing, and interview processes. He paused, and there was unmistakable pride in his voice. "I was the youngest candidate accepted that year. They were skeptical at first. They thought I was just a kid trying to live his father's dream. But I proved I had the aptitude, the determination, and the passion for it." "What made you decide to take this flight?" Sarah asked. "This specific flight at this specific time?" Victor took a sip of his soft drink before answering. "I was invited to attend a special advanced training program at a military flight facility outside Chicago. It's a 2-week intensive course for academy graduates who show exceptional promise. Only 15 students were selected nationwide. The program coordinator reached out to my grandmother and told me that several pilots who had served with my father have agreed to mentor me personally during the program. James and Sarah exchanged glances. "Who contacted you?" James asked carefully. "General Patricia Morrison," Victor said. "She's the commander of the Chicago Air Force Base. She said she knew my father, that she respected him greatly, and that she wanted to help his son achieve his dreams." James nodded slowly. "General Morrison is a good woman. She takes care of her people even after they've passed." "This flight was supposed to be just transportation," Victor continued. "I was supposed to arrive in Chicago, be picked up by the Academy liaison, and begin my training. But then," he looked at both pilots intently, "then I heard your voices and I realized you were the pilots. I felt something shift. And when you asked for my call sign, I decided to tell you the truth. I decided to trust you." "Why?" Sarah asked gently. "Because I wanted to meet people who knew my father," Victor said simply. "I wanted to understand who he was beyond the stories. I wanted to see him reflected in the people who loved him." His young eyes glistened with tears. "I wanted to know that his life meant something, that his sacrifice meant something." James stood abruptly, and before Victor realized what was happening, the captain had pulled him into a fierce embrace. When they separated, James's face was wet with tears. "Your father's sacrifice meant everything," he said firmly. "And meeting you right now in this moment has confirmed something I've believed for 7 years, that Major Victor Harrison left behind a legacy that matters, that his death wasn't meaningless because it produced you." Sarah also stood and embraced Victor, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to do remarkable things," she whispered. "I can feel it. You're going to earn that call sign and you're going to make your father proud. But more importantly, you're going to make yourself proud." "There's something else," Victor said when they finally sat back down. "Something I need to tell you. General Morrison told me that several pilots from my father's squadron would be at the training facility. She said they'd agreed to mentor me, but she wouldn't tell me who they were. She said she wanted it to be a surprise." James and Sarah smiled at each other, a knowing smile that suggested they understood exactly what General Morrison had orchestrated. "Victor," James said carefully, "I need to ask you something important. Is this what you want? Not because of your father, not because of obligation or legacy, but because you genuinely want to be a fighter pilot." Victor didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said with absolute certainty. "I've wanted it since I was 6 years old and didn't understand why my father wasn't coming home. I've wanted it every day since. Not because he did it, but because I want to do it. I want to fly faster than the speed of sound. I want to understand the science of aerodynamics at the deepest level. I want to serve my country the way my father did. And yes, I want to earn my own call sign, one that honors Viper but is distinctly my own." "Then you're going to do it," Sarah said with absolute confidence. "You're going to be magnificent at it." James raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To Victor Harrison, Jr.," he said. "To the young man who's going to carry his father's spirit forward while writing his own story." Sarah and Victor raised their cups in return. And in that small moment in a quiet corner of Chicago's airport, 3 people bound by grief and hope and the unbreakable thread of military legacy celebrated a new beginning. The Chicago Air Force Base sprawled across hundreds of acres, a sprawling complex of runways, hangars, training facilities, and administrative buildings. General Patricia Morrison had personally ensured that Victor Harrison, Jr. received the full welcome of the military community. Within 48 hours of his arrival, he had been outfitted in his Junior Pilot Academy uniform, assigned quarters in the officer's family housing, and integrated into the intensive 2-week training program with 14 other exceptional young aviators from across the nation. But Victor's experience was fundamentally different from that of his peers. On his first morning, before the official program began, James and Sarah took him on a private tour of the flight simulator facility. The room was vast, containing multiple full-motion F-22 Raptor simulators, massive, sophisticated machines that cost millions of dollars and could replicate nearly every conceivable flight scenario. The simulators were the bridge between theory and reality, the training ground where pilots learned to handle aircraft that exceeded the speed of sound. "This is where the real learning happens," James explained, running his hand across the exterior of one simulator. "These machines are so advanced that 90% of a pilot's training happens right here before they ever sit in an actual aircraft. The human body has limits. G-forces can cause loss of consciousness. Spatial disorientation can be deadly. These simulators teach your mind how to handle those extremes safely." Sarah pulled up Victor's preliminary test scores on a nearby computer. "Your academy work is exceptional," she said, studying the data. "Your physics scores, your spatial reasoning tests, your aeronautical knowledge, they're all in the top percentile. You have the foundation. Now we're going to teach you how to fly." Victor's first simulator session was humbling. Despite all his study, despite his knowledge of aircraft systems and aerodynamic principles, he found himself fighting the controls, overcorrecting, struggling with the mental processing required to manage multiple systems simultaneously. But he didn't give up. He didn't become frustrated. Instead, he approached it the way he approached everything, with methodical determination and a willingness to learn from every mistake. By the third day, something clicked. The instructors noticed it immediately. Victor moved through a complex combat maneuver sequence, a barrel roll combined with a controlled stall recovery, with a naturalness that shouldn't have been possible for someone with his limited experience. His hands worked the controls with precision. His eyes tracked the instruments with the ease of someone who'd been doing this for years. "That was exceptional," the flight instructor, Major David Torres, said when Victor emerged from the simulator. Torres was a decorated combat pilot with over 200 actual flight hours in F-22s. He wasn't easily impressed. "How did you do that so smoothly?" "I was visualizing what my father would do," Victor said honestly. "I've studied his flight records, the ones that are publicly available. I've watched video of his training. I tried to mirror his technique." Torres exchanged a look with James, who was observing the session. There was something almost eerie about the way Victor seemed to channel his father's instincts and abilities. It wasn't mimicry or luck. It was something deeper. It was genetic memory, muscle memory encoded in DNA, an inheritance of talent that transcended the physical. Over the following weeks, Victor became something of a phenomenon at the base. The other 14 students in the training program were exceptional, but Victor was different. He absorbed technical information with frightening speed. He understood the physics of flight at an intuitive level that most pilots took years to develop, and he had what James could only describe as the gift, that inexplicable quality that separated merely excellent pilots from the truly great ones. Word spread through the base quickly. Major Victor Harrison's son was here, and he was special. Veterans who had served with Viper began showing up to watch his training sessions. Flight mechanics who had worked on his father's aircraft came to shake his hand. Pilots who remembered his father's commanding presence saw echoes of it in this serious young boy with identical eyes and an identical commitment to excellence. But it wasn't just the training that changed Victor's life. It was the community that embraced him. General Morrison invited him to formal dinners where he sat at tables with decorated officers and their families. These men and women, most of whom had grieved the loss of Major Harrison, seemed to view mentoring his son as both a privilege and an obligation. They told him stories about his father that his grandmother had never mentioned, stories of Viper's jokes, his humanity, his fierce protection of his squadron members, his dreams for his family. One evening, a retired colonel named Robert Hendricks pulled Victor aside. Hendricks had been Viper's closest friend, his wingman on countless missions. "Your father loved you more than anything in this world," Hendricks said, his weathered face creasing with emotion. "He would call your mother from deployment and ask about you constantly. He had this vision of the future where you'd grown up to be an even better pilot than he was. He believed in you with absolute certainty. Victor absorbed these stories like a plant absorbing water. Each one added texture and dimension to his understanding of his father, not as a military legend or a tragedy, but as a real person with hopes and dreams and human vulnerabilities. James and Sarah became his primary mentors, seeing him almost daily. They taught him not just the technical aspects of flying but the philosophy behind it. They took him to the pilot's ready room where they shared strategies and debated tactics. They invited him to base functions. They made sure he understood that he wasn't alone in this journey. He was part of a family that extended far beyond blood relations. 6 weeks into the program, Victor completed his most advanced simulator mission, a complex air-to-air combat scenario against an AI-controlled adversary. The objective was nearly impossible: 4 enemy fighters, limited ammunition, challenging terrain, and multiple system failures to manage mid-flight. Most pilots took multiple attempts to complete it successfully. Victor completed it on his first try. When he emerged from the simulator, the entire observation room erupted. Instructors, visiting pilots, base personnel, everyone understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Major Tours, who had overseen hundreds of training sessions, had tears in his eyes. "That was flawless," he said simply. "That was the kind of flying I've only seen from the very best pilots in active service." James placed a hand on Victor's shoulder as they left the simulator facility. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "But I want you to know something, Victor. I'm proud of you, not because of who your father was, but because of who you are. You're becoming something remarkable." That evening, as Victor sat in his quarters reviewing the day's data, he realized something profound. The pressure he'd felt earlier, the weight of living up to his father's legacy, had transformed into something else entirely. It had become motivation. It had become purpose. It had become a connection not to the dead, but to the living, to the community that had rallied around him, to the mentors who believed in him, to the pilots and personnel who had chosen to invest in his future. The military community wasn't just preserving Major Victor Harrison's memory. They were nurturing his son's potential. They were ensuring that Viper's sacrifice had meaning, not because it had produced a copy of the original, but because it had produced someone entirely new, someone who would write his own story while honoring the one who had come before. Victor Harrison Jr. wasn't just living in his father's shadow anymore. He was stepping into the light. The story of the mysterious boy on Flight 447 eventually made it into the national media. A reporter from a Chicago news outlet caught wind of it through military channels. The young pilot trainee, who was the son of a fallen F-22 pilot, selected for an elite program, showing exceptional promise. The angle was irresistible: grief, redemption, legacy, the son walking in his father's footsteps. Within days, Victor's life had transformed again. Local news wanted interviews. Military publications ran feature stories. Social media filled with his photograph and his story. He became known as the boy pilot, the fallen hero's son, destiny's chosen child. The narrative was compelling, emotionally satisfying, and completely outside Victor's control. The attention started small and grew exponentially. At first, it was manageable. A few interviews, some congratulatory messages, the occasional fan mail from people moved by his story. But as the story proliferated across platforms, something shifted. Victor went from being a young man training to become a pilot to being a symbol, a living monument to his father's sacrifice, a poster child for military resilience, a symbol of American valor and duty. Everyone wanted a piece of him. Speaking requests came in from schools, military institutions, civic organizations. Media outlets wanted exclusive interviews. Producers from documentary series reached out about featuring his journey. Well-meaning people approached him constantly with their own stories of loss, their own connections to military service, their own need to find meaning in his narrative. Victor initially tried to accommodate everyone. He did interviews. He attended speaking engagements. He smiled for photographs, but inside something was fracturing. 4 months into his training, on a night when he couldn't sleep, Victor found himself walking through the base toward the Flight Operations building. He knew Captain James Mitchell was there. He'd seen his truck in the parking lot, conducting an overnight training session with some senior pilots. Without fully understanding why, Victor found himself walking toward the observation room where James was monitoring a simulation. James looked up as Victor entered, immediately recognizing the distress written across the young man's face. He excused himself from the observation room and led Victor to a quiet corner of the facility. "Talk to me," James said simply. Victor sat down heavily, suddenly feeling every ounce of the accumulated pressure he'd been carrying. "I don't know if I want to be a pilot anymore," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "or if I want it because it's expected of me." The admission hung in the air between them. James didn't respond immediately. He let the silence extend, understanding that Victor needed space to continue. "Everyone looks at me and sees my father," Victor continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "They don't see me. They see his legacy, his memory, his sacrifice. I'm not a person anymore, I'm a symbol. And I'm terrified that if I stop, if I change my mind about flying, if I decide I want to do something else entirely, then I'm failing him. I'm failing everyone who believed in him." James leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Can I tell you something about your father?" he asked. Victor nodded. "Major Victor Harrison doubted himself," James said. "A lot. People saw the confident pilot, the natural talent, the exceptional warrior. But your father had moments of real fear, real uncertainty. I remember once, after a particularly difficult mission, we were sitting in the ready room and he asked me, 'What if I'm not good enough? What if I mess up and get my squadron killed?'" Victor's eyes widened. Viper doubted himself. "All the time," James said firmly. "The difference between good pilots and great pilots isn't the absence of doubt. It's how they handle it. Your father took his doubt and transformed it into precision, into preparation, into an absolute commitment to excellence. But he never pretended the doubt wasn't there." James stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. "There's something I want you to understand, Victor. Your father lived his life for his country, for his duty, for his squadron. But you know what he told me he wanted more than anything? He wanted you to be happy. He wanted you to choose your own path. He said, and I remember this clearly, 'If my son becomes a garbage collector who loves his job and is kind to people, I'd be prouder of him than I would be if he became a pilot and hated every second.'" Victor felt tears beginning to form. "You're making that up." "I'm not," James said firmly. "That's exactly what he said. Because your father understood something crucial that too many people miss. Legacy isn't about forcing the next generation to replicate the past. Legacy is about passing down values, principles, and the freedom to build your own future." "But everyone expects—" "I know what everyone expects," James interrupted gently. "And here's the hard truth, Victor. You have two choices. You can live your life for everyone else's expectations. You can become the symbol they want you to be, the monument to your father's memory. Or you can have the courage to be yourself, even if that disappoints people, even if that contradicts the narrative they've created for you." Victor wiped his eyes. "What if I want to be a pilot, but I want it for me, not for him?" "Then that's exactly what you should do," James said. "But you have to be honest about it. You have to examine your motivations constantly and ask yourself, am I flying because this is genuinely my passion, or am I flying because I'm afraid of what people will think if I don't?" "How do I know the difference?" Victor asked, his voice small and uncertain. James returned to his seat and looked Victor directly in the eye. "You sit with the doubt. You let yourself imagine walking away. And if the thought of not flying breaks your heart, not because of your father, not because of expectations, but because flying itself is essential to who you are, then you know you're doing it for the right reasons." They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the base was quiet, the night deep and dark beyond the windows. Victor thought about all the hours he'd spent in simulators, all the technical knowledge he'd absorbed, all the maneuvers he'd practiced. And underneath all that, he thought about the moment when he first understood aerodynamics, the time he'd felt genuinely exhilarated during a flight simulation, the part of himself that came alive when he was thinking about flight and speed and the science of moving through the air. "I think I do want it," Victor said finally. "For me, not just for him." "Good," James said. "Then own that. Stop trying to be your father's legacy. Start being Victor Harrison Jr., a remarkable young man who happens to have a remarkable father but who is writing his own story." "But the media, the expectations." "Will always be there," James finished. "You can't control that, but you can control how you respond to it. You can control your own narrative. You can stand up and say, yes, my father was an exceptional pilot. Yes, I'm following a similar path. But I'm doing this for myself because this is what I choose." That's not betrayal. That's honesty. And that's more powerful than any symbol. Victor stood, and something in his bearing had shifted. The weight was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a crushing burden and more like responsibility he could choose to carry. "Thank you," Victor said quietly. "Go back to your quarters and get some sleep," James said. "And tomorrow I want you to think about something. Not about your father, about yourself. About what flying means to you when you strip away everyone else's expectations. Can you do that?" Victor nodded. As he walked out of the flight operations building into the cool night air, he felt something settling inside him, not certainty, but a clearer sense of his own agency. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a monument. He was a young man with his own dreams, his own potential, and the freedom to choose his own path. And that freedom, he realized, was the greatest gift his father could have left him. 18 months after that fateful flight from Denver to Chicago, Arlington Air Force Base was hosting a special ceremony. The hangar had been transformed into an auditorium, with rows of chairs arranged in careful military precision. American flags hung from the rafters. The base orchestra played softly in the background. And in the front row, General Patricia Morrison reviewed her remarks one final time. The auditorium was packed. Flight crews, base personnel, military families, retired officers, all had come to witness what many were calling the most inspiring story in modern military history. Media representatives sat in designated sections, their cameras ready. The event was being live-streamed to military installations around the world. But what most of the attendees didn't know was that this ceremony had a significance that went beyond what would be shown in news reports. This was a private moment made public, a moment that belonged to Victor Harrison Jr. and to all the people who had loved and lost the man whose legacy he carried. Victor sat backstage in a small room, wearing his dress uniform, navy blue with sharp creases, his Junior Pilot Academy insignia prominent on his sleeves. He was 16 years old now, taller than he'd been on that flight, more muscular from the physical demands of training, but with the same serious eyes that had captured everyone's attention in seat 15F. His mother stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. She'd finally come to see what her son had become. She'd finally healed enough to watch him step into the future her late husband had dreamed of. Beside her stood Victor's grandmother, the woman who had kept Viper's memory alive, who had guided Victor through grief and into purpose. "You ready?" his mother asked softly. "Yes," Victor said simply. In the auditorium, General Morrison stood and approached the podium. She waited for the applause to settle before she began to speak. 18 months ago, we didn't know a remarkable young man was about to enter our lives," she said, her voice clear and commanding. "We didn't know that on a commercial flight, seat 15F would hold someone special. We didn't know that Major Victor Harrison's son would walk through our gates and remind us why we serve, why we sacrifice, and why legacy matters." She paused, her eyes moving across the assembled crowd. "Today, we gather to honor Victor Harrison Jr. with the Young Aviator Excellence Award, the highest honor we can bestow on a civilian youth participant in our training programs. This award recognizes not just academic achievement or flying skill, though Victor excels in both. It recognizes character. It recognizes resilience. It recognizes a young man who has had to navigate extraordinary circumstances with grace and determination. The applause was thunderous. But before we present this award, I want to tell you a story, General Morrison continued. A story about a boy who boarded a flight with documents about fighter pilot training. A story about pilots who recognized a call sign and understood that they were witnessing something profound. A story about a military family that decided to invest in the future instead of dwelling in the past. And most importantly, a story about one young man's journey to understand that honoring your father's legacy doesn't mean copying his life. It means living your own life with the same courage and commitment he displayed. She smiled warmly. I'd like to invite Victor Harrison Jr. to join me on stage. The auditorium erupted as Victor walked out from the wings. He moved with the disciplined bearing he developed through months of training, his dress uniform crisp, his posture perfect. But his eyes were bright with emotion as he approached the podium. General Morrison pulled him into a brief embrace, then stepped aside to give him the microphone. Victor looked out at the sea of faces. He saw James and Sarah in the front row, both with tears streaming down their faces. He saw Colonel Hendricks, who had been his father's closest friend. He saw his mother and grandmother. He saw the other pilots and personnel who had mentored him, who had shared their memories of his father, who had chosen to invest in his future. "Thank you," Victor began, his young voice steady despite the emotion he was clearly experiencing. "This award means more to me than I can express, but I want to tell you something that's been on my mind for months, something I need to say publicly." He took a breath, gathering his thoughts. "My father died when I was 6 years old. For a long time I thought my grief was something I had to process alone. I thought losing him meant my life would always be defined by that loss. But 18 months ago, I boarded a flight from Denver to Chicago carrying my father's call sign and his memory. And I discovered something that changed everything. I wasn't alone, and I never had to be." Victor's eyes moved to James and Sarah. "I want to thank the pilots who recognized my father's call sign that day. I want to thank everyone who shared memories of him with me, who told me stories that made him real instead of just a legend. I want to thank General Morrison for orchestrating this program, for believing that honoring the fallen means investing in the living." He paused, his voice becoming more emotional. "But I also need to say this, and I want it on the record. I'm not living my life to be my father's legacy. I'm living my life to be my own." A hush fell over the auditorium. "My father was extraordinary. He was brave and skilled and dedicated. But he was also a person who wanted the people he loved to find their own paths. And for a long time, I was afraid that if I didn't become exactly like him, if I didn't follow precisely in his footsteps, I would be failing him and disappointing everyone who loved him." Victor looked directly at the camera feeds, speaking not just to the people in the hangar, but to the military community watching around the world. "I want to say clearly, I'm becoming a fighter pilot because I love flying. I'm training to be a pilot because aeronautics fascinates me. I'm pursuing this career because it aligns with my values and my dreams. And yes, I'm doing it partly to honor my father's memory. But I'm not doing it to be him. I'm doing it to be the best version of myself." He held up the award. "This honor isn't just recognition of my flying ability. It's recognition of something bigger. It's recognition that we can honor the dead by living fully, authentically, courageously. It's recognition that legacy isn't something you inherit passively. It's something you create through the choices you make and the person you choose to become." Victor's eyes found his mother's. She was crying openly, nodding, her expression radiating pride and release. "I want to tell my mother something," Victor said, his voice breaking slightly. Thank you for letting me find my own path. Thank you for healing so I could see that life continues after loss. And thank you for showing me that resilience isn't about staying stuck in the past, it's about moving forward. He turned back to the audience. My father's call sign was Viper, and when I first learned that I thought I had to become Viper too. But I realized something important. I don't want to be Viper. I want to be Victor. I want to earn my own call sign, create my own legacy, and fly my own missions. That's how I honor my father, not by being a copy of him, but by being the best version of myself. James stood, and slowly, everyone in the auditorium rose to their feet. The applause was emotional, intense, lasting several minutes. Victor stood there, holding the award, surrounded by the standing ovation of people who had invested in his journey. When the applause finally subsided, General Morrison returned to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been my honor to work with this remarkable young man. Victor Harrison Jr. represents everything we hope for in the next generation of military personnel. He represents courage, resilience, authenticity, and the understanding that honoring our heroes means living our best lives. To Victor, we believe in you. To the military families watching around the world, this is why we serve. We serve so that the next generation can dream bigger, reach higher, and live more fully than we ever imagined possible. As the ceremony concluded and people began to stand and applaud once more, Victor stepped down from the stage. James, Sarah, and Colonel Hendricks surrounded him immediately, embracing him with a ferocity that spoke of years of grief transformed into hope. "Your father would be so proud," Colonel Hendricks said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud," Victor replied, "and that matters too." As he walked out of the hangar that evening, surrounded by the people who loved him, Victor Harrison Jr. understood something profound. The weight of expectation hadn't disappeared. The responsibility of carrying his father's memory remained, but it had transformed into something else entirely, not a burden but a gift, not a chain binding him to the past, but a foundation from which to build the future. Somewhere above, he imagined his father looking down, not at a copy or a continuation, but at his son, flying his own flight path, writing his own story, and honoring the past by creating the future. That was true legacy. That was how you said thank you to those who had gone before.